Okay, my name is Dan Phillips, and I'm here to talk about the anti-cult movement in Russia. But let me just say about the last presenter. I've always been told when presenting to get to the room early, to kind of get ready. That almost emotionally touched me so much. It's hard for me to get up here and talk. I come from my mother's family had 16 children in it, and I've had more than one cousin sent off to an adjustment camp, if you will. I dated a woman for a while who ran a program for. I'm sorry. I ran a program for a while. I dated a woman for a while who ran a program for troubled girls. And one time I said, it's in Northern California. How did these troubled girls get there? And they said, well, we have a transportation service. And I said, transportation service? It makes it sound like there's an Uber that will be waiting for you. She basically told me it was two thuggish guys who would show up at the door and they didn't need to knock because they already had the parents' permission. We do know that psychiatric treatment can be done. Many times it needs your permission, but if it's for your child, it's your permission. That's the key point. Okay. Real quick before I start, I do want to mention that I am here from Kentucky. I've lived here for 25 years, and I want to give a couple quick comments about Kentucky that I don't think a lot of people know. This state is full of contradictions. You have people in this state, farms near where I live, horse farms worth $100 million. You have people living in Eastern Kentucky that are living in abandoned buses. The middle class in Kentucky is somewhat absent. You feel at times almost like there's a caste system here. You are the haves or you have nots. You own the factory or you work at the factory. Kentucky makes bourbon. Are you aware of this? Kentucky also has several dry counties where you cannot purchase alcohol. Kentucky, many people are against alcohol. Unfortunately, and I come from a background like this, unfortunately, getting pills from the doctor, even if you lie to do so, is seen as okay. So some of the same people I know in dry counties where people are not purchasing alcohol, the prescription pill abuse rate is just through the roof, okay? Real quick, I study religion quite a bit, and the Asbury Revival, I don't know if anybody heard about this in the last several months, that was nearby. If anybody's familiar with Carrie Nation, she was a 6-foot tall woman back in Prohibition that carried a hatchet with her and went around breaking things up. She grew up about a few miles from where I live, and I live about 75 minutes from here. William Branham, anybody's familiar? He's from Kentucky, not too far from here. Jefferson Davis was born in this state, as was Lincoln. Kentucky has a lot of small counties, and it's very big into religion. I used to live in a county in Kentucky. My kids weren't born there. They were born 35 miles away because that was the closest hospital. That county and the neighboring county combined had 37,000 people and 185 separate churches. So Kentucky is full of contradictions. Anyways, let me move on with this presentation. I did handouts because I wasn't aware that I was going to have my presentation submitted by last week. So I just did a PowerPoint, but I did the handouts here. Let me introduce myself and my co-speaker who couldn't be here today. My name is Dan Phillips. I'm Associate Professor of Criminal Justice at Campbellsville University, which is a Christian school here in this state, traditionally Baptist. I hold a PhD in sociology and a master's in theology that I earned recently. And I've taught criminal justice, sociology, theology, and human services classes since 1994. I've done various publications over the years concerning mental health issues in the criminal justice system, and increasingly I'm focusing on religious issues. I have been a contributor to the International Journal of Coercion, Abuse, and Manipulation. I did a book review on leaving Christian fundamentalism and creating a new identity. And just recently they published something that had to do with narcissism in the church, which is a problem. I grew up with parents who were both my grandfathers were independent fundamentalist Baptist preachers. If you're not familiar with this is we don't drink, we don't dance, we don't chew, and we don't hang with those who do, if you're familiar with that sort of thing. My parents met in IFB college, and my parents have been in the middle ever since then of leaving that. Now, I do want to make something clear before I get started. I only feel it's fair to bring this up. I am not Baptist anymore, but I was baptized and chrismated into the Eastern Orthodox Church. Now, I attend currently an Antiochian church, but the church I was baptized and chrismated into is OCA, that's Orthodox Church in America. This is the English-speaking offshoot of the Russian Orthodox Church. Today in this presentation, I will be critiquing the Russian Orthodox Church in some way. So I want to bring that up. I list my email there in case you need to reach me. If you go onto the second page, there's Tommy Valentine I've listed real quick. He is a professor of theology and Christian studies. He was an active pastor for 28 years. And I thought that was important just to bring up as we talk about. Hello? Okay. Real quick, definitions and characteristics of a cult. Historically, the term cult could simply mean a group of people dedicated to a specific subject matter. By the 19th century, the term cult came to mean an unorthodox group of zealots and eccentric believers. Characteristics of cults include authoritarian control, I think we all know that, maximizing dependency, extremist beliefs, highly dogmatic, and questions are not permitted. The groups that I grew up in, if you asked the question, you were suspect because you should already know the answer. And if you have to ask, then you don't know, then maybe you aren't a Christian, this sort of thing. Isolation from society, keeping members away from others, including family. So when I say isolation, I don't just mean you spend time with these folks. You probably spend all of your extra time with these folks, your money. If you have a problem with a family member, well, maybe that family member just needs to be at a distance because they're interfering with this group here. Actually, it reminds me very much of an abusive domestic situation, right? So a man's abusing his wife and it's kind of like, well, you know, your mother causes us a lot of trouble in this relationship. Maybe if you didn't spend so much time with your mother, that sort of thing. And it usually revolves around a charismatic leader. Now, I'm sure some of you already know this, but the 1960s and 1970s were really a prime time for cults. Why do I say that? Well, anytime you have social upheaval of any kind, okay, it creates what Dvorkin used to call an anomic situation, right? Kind of normlessness is what happens when you have, this is what happens like when Hurricane Katrina hit. All of a sudden, you don't know what's what, okay? When you have a situation like that, people are looking for belonging, people are looking for meaning, and they're looking for direction. Now, people have told me that these days, we're very scientific and we're not into cults anymore. People aren't that, quote, stupid. The truth of the matter is the more complicated things get, the more isolated people get, the more people lack meaning in their life. Cults can become a fairly attractive thing, at least up front. They've done studies to look at people who join cults. I think there's a lot of people who believe that people join cults because there's just something defective in that individual. I think we do this with a lot of people, right? Somebody goes through a problem, we want to believe that could never happen to me. Well, the truth of the matter is when they investigate people who join cults, what they typically find is that they're at a crossroads in their life. One of the guys who came out of Jonestown talked about he just left Vietnam, he had just left the military, and he was looking for meaning in life. Okay. Anti-cult movement in the 1970s and 1980s. One definition given is that an anti-cult movement consists of government, non-government, and individuals that promote cult awareness, uncover coercive practices to attract and retain members, and help those who have become involved with harmful practices. Okay, there have been various people who have been involved with the anti-cult movement. Some of the people, if you go back to the 70s, were charged with kidnapping. So we look at a cult, we listen to the stories of the woman who just talked before me, and we say, that's terrible that somebody's a part of that group. In the United States, however, for persons over 18, they're considered a free adult. Grabbing them off the street, taking them somewhere against their will, and quote, deprogramming them is illegal. So what we've had in the past is anything from people providing information about groups, warning people about groups, but we've also gone so far at times that we've kidnapped people and quote, deprogrammed them against their will. Haddon in 1997 came up with a taxonomy of groups that are anti-cult. The first is opposition based on religious beliefs, right? This is when my church looks at your church and says, you guys are heretics, right? So we have a problem with you religiously. I'll tell you a quick story on the side. I'm into powerlifting. That's kind of like my thing that I do in my spare time. All right. And there's some people who power lift to get real strong use steroids. And so there's always a question in the gym, how do you know if someone's using steroids? And the joke always is, well, if they can lift more weight than you, then they're obviously using steroids. In much the same vein, like what is a cult according to a religious group? Well, if they ain't us, they may be a cult. 2, secular opposition. Focus here is on individual autonomy. They reject mind control and deceptive proselytization. They focus on control, not theology. Typically, this involves family members. They even may want to destroy the cult itself. The third group would be apostates, former members. Former members telling their stories. Many times they're coordinating and being encouraged by anti-cult groups. And then finally, is a fourth group that I never really thought about very much. These are entrepreneurs, journalists, lawyers, broadcasters, people who write books who've made a living off of doing so. Now, I want to talk about the Russian anti-cult movement here. To some degree, I got onto this topic after joining the OCA Church, which is a subsidiary of the Russian Orthodox Church. 1990, the law on freedom of religion was adopted under Gorbachev. All right, so after years and years and years of having repressive laws concerning religion, Russia had developed a law that promoted separation of church and state, equal protection for all faiths, regardless of origin or size. At this time, you see a resurgence of the Russian Orthodox Church, Catholicism, Islam, Judaism, and Buddhism. Also, there were many groups that were new to Russia. So what you see at this time is more traditional religions that have dominated those areas start to come back. At the same time, and I grew up Baptist, and Baptists are famous for sending out missionaries to encourage other people to join their church. So what you begin to see are groups like Jehovah's Witnesses. You see people like Pentecostals, Baptists, groups that were new to the area moving in. Now, in 1996, Kirill, who you're probably familiar with as being the patriarch of the Russian Orthodox Church, he said, so this is 6 years after that law, he said that the law on freedom of religion had resulted in hordes of missionaries dashing in, believing the former Soviet Union to be a vast missionary territory. Okay. Now, in 1997, the Russian Federation passed federal law number 125-FZ on freedom of conscience and religious associations. This ended tolerance of religious minorities in favor of traditional religion. At that time, to be a religion that was legitimate, you had to be registered. Well, to be registered, you had to show that you had been in Russia for 15 years. Failure to be registered could get you into trouble. So missionaries from new groups were deemed illegitimate. And when I talk about missionary work, I don't just mean setting up a church. I mean, if I come to you on the street and say, would you like to come to my Baptist, Pentecostal, whatever church, that's missionary work. And so what you see is 7 years after this initial law, there's a real crackdown on new churches, new religious movements. Also, what they said was, like so many governments, if the Russians didn't want you to be there, they would simply lose your paperwork, right? I mean, you were just never going to get registered. I'm going to bring up a few people. I know we only have a few minutes here. One of the key figures that you see in the Russian anti-cult movement is Alexander Dvorkin. Okay, there's other people, but he's a key figure. He was born in 1955 in Moscow, came to the United States in 77, returned to Russia in early 92, and became the premier anti-cult movement leader in Russia, with influence in Europe to this day. He worked with the blessing of the Orthodox Church patriarch. He heavily influenced, now this is key, he heavily influenced both secular and Orthodox Church communities. They say that he first focused on small marginalized groups. So there might be a group of 30 or 40 people that have developed their own religious group over here. He focused on those first, but soon after he went after larger, more sectarian groups. He's been the vice president since 2009 of FECRIS, the European Federation of Centers of Research Information on Sectarians. He also coined this term where he talked about totalitarian sectarians. What he tried to do is he tried to say, hey, we're protecting you from people like Hitler and Stalin by making sure that these groups don't move in. Okay, these new religious groups move in and kind of take over. So he leveraged people's fear about that. Real quick, I mentioned Fekris. They began in 1994. They investigate cults in Europe. They claim to be religiously and philosophically neutral. They have been criticized for not being tolerant of religious minorities, criticized for developing a way to dismantle religious minorities, and criticized for favoring traditional religious groups. So they provide information, and some people say, they're not fair. The Russian anti-cult legislation. Now, Dvorkin has made many, many statements at different times about various kinds of groups. What I've done here is first I list the groups, and then I mention just a laundry list of statements. So I'm not really taking each group and attaching it to a specific statement. I'm just kind of mixing them together. He's had problems with Mormons, Pentecostals, Hare Krishna, Jehovah's Witnesses. The Witnesses were banned in 2017, outright banned. Okay. At different times, he has referred to some of these groups as people who are just interested in money. The people coming here are working for the CIA. They're performing secret occult rituals. They're promoting destructive lifestyles. They're brainwashing. They're trying to create a new world order. They're against Russian heritage, and they're cancerous cells, and they're drug dealers. So they're coming here. They're coming to upset our culture. They're bad people. Stay away from them. The next slide that I list there says Russian anti-cult rehabilitation. I'm not going to go over that. I just want you to know that there are several centers in Russia where former cult members can go. Some of these, just like our last presenter, some of these are operated by psychologists. Many are simply operated by priests of the Russian Orthodox Church. And they're not we call them mental health facilities. They may have a lot more to do with indoctrinating people religiously. Critics of the Russian anti-cult movement. There's a group called USRF, U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. They claim that Russia's laws are repressive to religious minorities and give the Russian government the kind of control that existed in the Soviet era. The anti-cult movement in Russia has linked religious minorities to extremism and even terrorism. And that's something I can't stress enough. So it's not just that this group is weird, does odd things, but they are a threat to national security. There's even a lot of talk about spiritual security of the Russian people. So we're protecting you from people bombing a building, and we're protecting you from people destroying your faith. In 2016, federal anti-terrorism laws were passed in Russia, 374 FZ and 375 FZ. These laws also regulated missionary activity in Russia. So these are anti-terrorism laws that give the government a great deal of power to follow, record, collect data on people who are terrorists, but they mix that in with religious people as well. And so what you have in Russia is a situation where terrorist, new religious movement, it all gets mixed together and all gets handled by the same kind of agency. Let's see. USRIF in 2017 recommended to the U.S. State Department that Russia be designated as a country of particular concern under the international laws of religious freedom of 1998, considered Russia to be one of the world's worst violators of religious freedom. Anti-cult movement Russia today in U.S. in the 1970s. Proponents of the anti-cult movement in Russia claim that they are protecting religious freedom by controlling cult activity. So they say, we're going to get rid of these cults so you can be religiously free. Opponents of the anti-cult movement in Russia claim that they are protecting your religious freedom by decrying those involved in the anti-cult movement. So both groups are saying our actions are trying to keep you free religiously. Which produces more religious freedoms? Question I ask, which protects its citizens more from being coerced, abused, and manipulated? And at the end here, I made a few quick comparisons between the US and Russia and their anti-cult movements. How are the US anti-cult movement in the 1970s and the recent Russian anti-cult movement similar, and how are they different? Both seek to protect citizens from extremist groups that are abusive. That's fair enough. Both provide information about those they deem to be cults. The US movement was led more by families than the government. I'm not saying the government didn't get involved, but it wasn't something that started and was the sole territory of the government. The U.S. movement had less support from religious groups. Now, I'm not saying that the Catholic Church didn't have something to say about cultic groups, but they certainly weren't at the level of the Russian Orthodox Church. The U.S. movement was answerable legally. Now, what does that mean? Well, in the United States, you can be a religious group. We have a great deal of religious freedom. There's one group that I won't name in particular that does not like the idea of seeking medical attention when you have an ailment. The United States has said fine, but if you neglect your child when they're hurting and they die, we charge you with manslaughter. So what we've done in the United States is said, you can be free religiously, but here are your boundaries. You exceed these boundaries and you can get yourself into trouble. In the United States, if you make claims against a group that are false, they can sue you in court. So what I'm trying to say is that in the United States, people are answerable a little bit more legally than what they might be in Russia. The US movement still allows for more religious diversity. The Russian movement has had the support of both government legislation and the Russian Orthodox Church. A couple quick reflections. No one wants their family members to be part of an abusive group, right? I don't, I'm sure you don't. No one wants criminal activity to impact them. How much freedom are you willing to give up to be safe? Now, we may look at Russia and say, well, this is just crazy. They're outlawing these religious groups so they can be safe. If you look at what happened in the United States after the 9/11 attacks, you scare a group of people, you say these extremists are coming into our country, they're subverting our way of life, they're going to kill people, more of this is going to happen. And all of a sudden, the same people who believe in freedom are like, well, I want to be free, but I want to be free of being afraid of those people. So I'm willing to give the government more power to keep me safe. It's the same kind of thing that's what's going on in Russia. How could laws be designed to allow for religious freedom while protecting people from abusive treatment? What I'm trying to get at here is, how can you say you get to be a religious group that has protection, but here's some boundaries? There are some deliverance ministries, the woman before me reminded me of this, where they have tried to do what I'll call an exorcism, and some of it involved wrapping somebody up in a blanket, and we've had children die. The United States government didn't say that group cannot exist, but it did say when you do that, we can put you into prison. So I think what we see more in the United States is, here are a series of laws to keep people safer. Your religion, you can practice your religion, you step outside these boundaries, you're going to prison. Anyways, that's what I had for you for today.